Before you sew your blanket pieces together, you'll need to prepare each square so that it lies nice and flat. As you can see at the moment, the edges of this knitted square are curled, and there's also a bit of unevenness to the surface of the pattern, and there are a few ends to weave in. So what we're going to do is weave in the ends first and then tackle the other two issues. When you're weaving in ends, what you would normally do on a piece like this is work into the fabric that hasn't got any stranding across the back. And because on this particular square, all of our ends are at the corners, we can do that. So what we're going to use is a technique called duplicate stitch. It's also known as twist darning. And what we're going to do is actually trace the path of the stitches with the woven in end. So I'll start by going in a few stitches from the corner. So once I've gone in my first stitch, I need to follow the path that particular stitch takes, working around the loop that it's made on the back of the knitted work. And then you pull it, but don't pull it super tight. And then now we're going to go around the bottom loop. So we're going to go under and up. And we keep doing that until we've traced maybe 4 or 5 stitches all the way along. So I'll do that and then I'll show you what it looks like. So I now have woven in using duplicate stitch, and if I turn the piece onto its side, you can see that these stitches are slightly raised, but otherwise the actual weaving in is completely invisible from the back and from the front, which is what we're after. And next thing I'll do is cut off this tail, but I'm not going to cut it right next to where I've woven in. I'm going to leave about 1 centimetre of yarn free, and that's because after I've blocked the piece, which is the next stage that we'll cover in a minute, I don't want any risk of the yarn pulling back through. Blocking actually stretches the fabric a little bit, and so if I cut the tail right next to the stitch, then it can start to thread back. So I'll just get my scissors and just leave a little gap and cut. And that's my finished piece of weaving in. You can use the duplicate stitch weaving in process for a contrast colour yarn as well. Here I've done it with the white yarn against the rosemary background, and if I turn it over, where I've woven that in, it remains completely invisible. When weaving in ends on a piece of stranded colourwork knitting, things get a bit trickier. On the wrong side of the work, there isn't an obvious place to work duplicate stitch. So what I do is I weave under and over the wrong side strands, and I'll show you how I do that. So I'm not going to use the large strands to weave under and over because that would be too unsightly. Instead, I'm going to use these single stitches as my weaving points. So I'll just find the first one. I'm actually at this edge here. Now I could in theory work duplicate stitch along this line of knitting here, but actually because the rest of the piece is worked in stranded colourwork, I want to just stick with using the wrong side strands. So I'm going to go under these 2 stitches and then over these 2. So it's quite a big gap. You need to keep your knitting nice and loose when you're sewing nice and loose when you do this. And as I work along, I'm just looking for these single stitches to go under and over. I'm working under and over pairs, not for any particular reason other than it just feels quite natural. You do have to make a judgment call sometimes when you're doing this kind of tidying up. So as you can see, these are my woven pieces of yarn, and it doesn't really show too much. So I'll just snip that end as before, about 1 centimetre from the last woven point, and then it's on to blocking.